Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Oddly Specific, the only podcast that covers everything from private equity to Pete Davidson. Today, back by popular demand, we have Michael Fenne from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. I know y'all love him. I know we have a lot of questions for him. Michael, welcome back to Oddly Specific.
Thanks so much for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
Oh my gosh, you were our first guest.
I was.
And since then, we have had on all sorts of folks who are connected to the private equity industry, but people constantly come back to your episode because they want to hear from someone who's in this every single day. And they also want to understand what private equity even is, which you provided a great overview in our first episode. So when I invited you back, and we're going to talk about a bunch of things, but one of the first things I said was, could you just tell us what private equity is again? What is private equity?
I think you asked me if I was at a party, how would I describe it to somebody? And the way I would do that is, so there's private equity firms. They are investment firms, and they come in and buy companies. That's what they're mostly responsible for. So I'm going to distinguish between private equity and public equity, or the stock market, as most people know it. If you're buying ownership of a company on the stock market, there's more transparency. You know kind of who owns it. There's transparency requirements, reporting requirements. None of that exists with private equity. There's no stock. Investment firm just takes complete ownership of it privately, and there's no reporting requirements or any sort of transparency on how they're running the companies that they own. And their private equity is everywhere in our economy. Healthcare is the area that I focus on, but we also have some of my colleagues look at housing, fossil fuel investments, labor and jobs like retail jobs. And we talked last episode, or on the first episode, about private equity's investments in services in prisons and jails. Their goal is to make a financial return by buying these companies, and then they like to say make them more efficient. I think it means pull more money out of them, whether that's driving down wages or working hours, or spending less on resources that a company needs, or driving up costs for people who are buying things from a private equity owned company.
That's a fantastic explanation. And I would sit next to you for the rest of the dinner party and ask you a million questions, but I'm a little biased. Since you came on, so much has happened in healthcare, specifically around private equity. I mean, we've been seeing everything with Steward, and that's in Massachusetts. We had Senator Markey on to talk about what happened there, and you're seeing these nurses testify that, there was basic healthcare that they could not provide because they did not have the medical supplies because of, the way that ownership had been transferred. When you heard some of that testimony, which I'm sure you did, I know your colleague Eileen O'Grady was at some of that testimony. Were you surprised at all by any of what was being said by the folks who worked in these hospitals?
I wasn't surprised, and I chalk that up to Eileen and my colleagues who have done more research than I have on Steward about how basically the hospital chain, its owner, it was acquired by a private equity firm, which took a lot of money out of it, put a lot of debt onto the chain, and made it so that it was harder for Steward to cover its expenses, pay its wages, and ultimately led to the bankruptcy that we saw earlier this year. And that, I think, is a good example of how private equity kind of operates, is they will take ownership of a hospital chain or a company or a veterinary provider, and they'll use financial tactics, whether it's loading a company up with debt or finding ways to cut costs. And they'll take as much money as they can out of it until they can't anymore. They sold Steward, the private equity firm that owned it. They sold it before it went bankrupt, but Steward was still living with the consequences of private equity ownership today, even years after its sale.
Right. So that's kind of what private equity does too, is like they then keep something for a certain amount of time, then they sell it, and they're kind of like, oh, our hands are clean and we're leaving you with all of this.
Right.
So I'm glad you brought up veterinary care, because that's a big focus of what we're going to talk about. But there's something that happened that was huge in the news this week, and that is that Jessica Simpson might be getting a divorce.
Oh,
Just
no.
kidding.
That's awful.
I know, no. But then this other thing happened in that we had an election, and, we will be having a new old president. And I don't mean, well, he is kind of older, like all things considered. We are going to have another Trump administration. And so I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about that, because with a new administration comes new opportunities for private equity regulation or private equity, doing better. So I'd love to know, how did private equity thrive, survive during the Trump administration? Part one.
Private equity during the Trump administration, based on the Trump administration's acts, it seems like they had a little more room to work during the Trump administration. They loosened up the rules on where private equity could get their money. So if you have a 401k, the Trump administration made it so that your 401k could go into private equity. If you're an individual who wants to invest in or who may give money to private equity, he also loosened the limits around that. And then Trump appointed a lot of judges that have long-term appointments that we are living with the consequences of. And before going into the judges, I want to draw a contrast between the first Trump administration and this current administration that we're in, which has taken great steps towards reining in the excesses of private equity. Most of that happens kind of under the headline level with the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, which are all appointed by the president. Their heads are appointed by the president. And the FTC, those agencies have been really great about going after private equity and investigating kind of the impacts of private equity's investments in healthcare and the economy. We're worried, based on the priorities that we believe this next administration has, that private equity, again, will have a bit more room to do what they want, have less restrictions, and that these investigations that started under this administration and some of the lawsuits that have been brought against some of the worst case companies, we're worried we're not going to see as much of that or any of that in the next administration. We are going to continue fighting for accountability and transparency against private equity, but it's going to be a more difficult fight than it has been these last 3 to 4 years.
So essentially, the Biden administration came in and put some guardrails on private equity and held some accountability to private equity, it seems.
The Biden administration, through different agencies, has looked at kind of the problems that we've identified coming from private equity and tried to address them, whether by investigating to find out more about the impacts, lawsuits to address impacts that we do know about, and then just bringing more attention to private equity's involvement in our lives so that people who want to be aware will know about what private equity is doing.
Right. Like if my emergency room is now owned by private equity or something of that nature, it would be more easy to figure that out.
There haven't been legal steps taken to make it easier to find out. There's still, transparency continues to be a big problem. I think that the solutions to the problem are probably required more time. And this administration, the Biden administration, got the ball rolling and got the ball rolling in a really good way. So we're hopeful that the Trump administration kind of keeps that accountability on private equity, but it's going to be more difficult.
Then the last question that I have for you is, we are at the podcast, we've been grateful to have on Senator Warren and Senator Markey. And two of the things that they both talked about, Senator Markey has his health over wealth bill, which, is due to all the great work that he's been doing around Steward. And then Senator Warren has the Stop Wall Street Looting. Those are both geared towards putting these guardrails on private equity. With the House and the Senate, the House at this point has not been called. I think it's looking like it will be red, and the Senate is red. With the House and the Senate in those places, what do we anticipate happening with bills like that?
Those important bills will probably be put on hold on the federal level during this administration, during Republican control of Congress. There are a lot of state efforts to put in place similar bills, and so energy might be redirected towards state houses to get these measures in place. But that still leaves people in the states that don't have those protections out to dry, which is why it's important that those two federal bills really be passed so that we have protection against private equity looting on a national level.
All right. Well, I'm not backing down on those, so I'll be talking about those. Okay. But the real reason I asked you here, before all of this happened, and we could have been having a very different conversation today, but I wanted to talk to you about private equity in veterinary care, because I'm a pet owner. You're a pet neighbor, I have found out.
Yes.
So I did say to Michael off camera, I said, just, do you like animals? And you did say that you like animals.
I have a cat. He's my neighbor. I don't know where he lives. He lives with one of my neighbors, but I call him my neighbor. I'm not responsible for his pet care, so I don't have that personal angle. But yeah, I'm a big fan of pets, big fan of animals.
Yeah, I'm an animal lover myself, and I spend a lot of time at the vet. And something that I have found as I have been researching private equity has been the hold that private equity has taken over veterinary practices. So can you just sort of explain to us how is this happening? How did this happen? Why do we think this is happening? And how far is the reach of private equity in veterinary care?
What's happening is private equity is coming up and buying a bunch of already existing veterinary clinics. This has happened in the last 5 to 10 years or so, is that about a decade ago, actually today still about half of veterinary clinics are independently owned, but that number is getting smaller because more and more independent clinics are getting bought up by these large chains that are owned by private equity. And they're doing this across the country. I've seen estimates, maybe 20 different private equity firms that own companies that do this. And the largest one that I know of has 1,000 to 2,000 animal hospitals in it. And that's out of about 30,000 animal hospitals. So it's a small fraction, but it's not insignificant, especially because of how much momentum is behind private equity coming into veterinary care right now.
Now, what private equity firm is that has such a stronghold over the market?
That's the private equity arm of a conglomerate called JAB Holding Company. The veterinary company is called National Veterinary Associates. They were actually subject to, this gets to what we were talking about with the FTC and the other agencies and how important they are. JAB and National Veterinary Associates were subject to a lawsuit from the Federal Trade Commission a couple years ago. They had been buying up a lot of local clinics, and the FTC said, you need to pump the brakes a little bit. And what they did was, in 2 states, Texas and California, they made it so that JAB had plans to buy some more clinics. And the FTC said, you need to sell some of the ones you already have because you control too much of these local markets.
So almost like a non-compete against themselves? Kind of like I'm trying to think of how I would...
I think more like an anti-monopoly action is what they're taking.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. And so, I did listen, I love a printout, Michael. I printed out this letter. This is a letter that was sent from, I believe it was Senator Blumenthal and Senator Warren to, is it JAB or JAB?
I've been saying it JAB, but I've never heard it actually verbalized.
Don't you think that's so weird too? That we don't even hear the names of these places, but they own Panera.
We don't hear the names. I mean, they put themselves out there, but they try to keep their kind of profile low so no one's talking about them. And we have no way to know whether they're JAB or JAB.
That probably helps them with SEO.
I wouldn't know enough about that.
I'm just saying. But what I found really interesting about this letter, so Senator Warren and Senator Blumenthal send them this letter in August, and similar to ones that I've seen with WellPath and HIG, they gave them a deadline. And from what I can tell, they got back to them by the deadline. But one of the things that I found really interesting is they ask them, we're talking dozens of questions, probably 100, almost 100 questions here, maybe around that, about okay, give us some specifics on things. And one of the things was the average rates that they charge for different things. And so JAB writes back, and first of all, they don't answer all the questions.
Of course not.
Which to me is just so wild. The fact that you are not held to answer these questions, but is that because they are private equity?
I don't think it's because they're private equity, but that's part of it. They don't have the same reporting requirements as other companies. So while there might be other information about a company if it was publicly traded, this is one of the only paths there is to finding information about this company. And if they stonewall or don't want to answer all the questions, that probably means that we need stronger regulations and laws to get that information from them.
Well, I'll have you know, I did my own deep dive. And so I was looking up veterinary practices that are owned by them and trying to see okay, what do they actually charge for a checkup? What do they? A lot of these places don't do those kind of services. They do like the really expensive services first of all, and they don't list them on the website, you know? And so they know that when you are hit with that cost, it is because you are standing there with your pet who's in a critical state, and you're going to say like, yeah, that's fine. I'll pay $2,000 because I want to save my animal. So I feel like, of course they don't want to be forthright with what they're charging on things because it's, high prices.
Right. And especially if they, under private equity ownership, have an incentive to increase their prices to make more money, they don't want us tracking that and being able to identify it and point out the problem.
Right. Like they don't want you to know like, oh, last year it was only $200 to do that. And now it's $275, right? Like
that's one of the kind of limits of looking into veterinary care versus human health care is that a lot of what we know comes from like news articles and personal reports. And there aren't like big academic studies that talk about how private equity impacts veterinary care yet. I think that it's important that there is a focus on that because it really drives people to want to address the problem sometimes.
What are you seeing? Because I know you've done a lot of research on this. What are you seeing when these private equity firms actually come in and take over these practices? What is the care like? What is the cost like?
What I've seen based on news reports and personal stories is that people will talk about how the prices go up after private equity comes in. And we've also heard reports from workers at these companies that prices go up or that they may have to do more work. They may be encouraged to push more services onto pets that may not be necessary.
Can we use private equity's track record of how they have been in human medical care as a predictor of how they will be in veterinary care?
I think so. I think that the problems that we've seen from private equity in human healthcare are an omen of what's going to come in veterinary care. Veterinary care is really developing and becoming more. People care about their pets and want to get the best health care for their pets. And so they're looking for services that end up a lot of the time looking like human health care. And private equity sees that. They see that people are more willing to spend more money. They jump in with the goal of raising the prices, getting more money for themselves. And so right now, private equity is acquiring a lot of veterinary practices and consolidating them. But I think down the line, there's a risk that some of the things that we see in human health care that have to do with financial tactics and engineering are going to end up in veterinary care. There's like the real estate play. A lot of private equity firms buy human health care offices because of the real estate. That's the same case with veterinary care. And I think that something that is possibly putting on a hold on that for now is that, well, normally private equity firms try to sell their companies within 3 to 7 years.
This was a question I had for you because to me right now, it sort of seems like a private equity firm could say, we're in this for the long haul. This is like great for us. Why would we want to get out? And so that's a good question. Yeah. What's going on there?
With veterinary care, I think there is a time limit. A lot of veterinary practices were acquired by private equity during the pandemic because so many people were getting companions to join them at home.
Work has changed. A lot of people work from home now. Yeah.
And so what I think might happen based on the research I've done is they're focused on pets get healthcare at the beginning of their life and then when they're older. And these private equity companies are waiting for that second wave to hit when these pets that were acquired when they were young get old and need health care again. So private equity is kind of expecting a second wave to come from the pandemic a few years down the line. So they're trying to kind of build up their market share, acquire as many practices as they can so that when that wave hits, they can profit from it.
Right. Like, so for example, the puppy that you got during the pandemic is, in a couple years going to be turning 7, 8 years old, might need some type of specialized care. I mean, I have lots of people in my life who have had to take their dogs to physical therapy, things like that. And I think that, is wonderful. I'm not like discrediting that, but where private equity sees dollar signs there, we see the love of our pet and its happiness and its health. And so you sent me, before we met, an article about this. Is it Shore Ventures?
Shore Capital.
Shore
Partners.
Capital. And that is exactly what appears to be happening there, is that they seem to be betting big on veterinary clinics.
Yes, Shore Capital Partners own 2 veterinary companies already, Mission Veterinary Partners and Southern Veterinary Partners, and they are discussing, based on an article that came out this week, merging those two companies and creating just one veterinary company, which gets into this whole drive to consolidate.
So would that be something that like you would look at and you would say, well, that needs regulation?
That does need regulation. And I think that a good example of the type of regulation it needs is what the FTC did to JAB a couple years ago, which is if your veterinary provider has too many locations in one area, you can't go down the street and get lower prices, or it's a monopoly in one area. So they're trying to stop these companies from getting too much control in one area, because then they have control over the prices in that city, and then also the wages that they pay workers at the veterinary clinics. If they're the only game in town, then they have the most power.
Oh, for recruiting. And also vet school is very expensive.
Yes.
And it takes a lot of time. So a lot of people graduate with a lot of student loan debt. And so when they get in the game, it can probably be really hard to get started independently. But if you find a place that, like that's owned by private equity and they say, come on in, or they come to you and say, hey, let me buy your practice.
That's what private equity firms, that's kind of how they market themselves to veterinarians that are looking to maybe retire or looking for some support on the administrative side, because it involves running a veterinary practice, involves bookkeeping, administrative hiring. And so the private equity owned companies come in and say, we'll take care of that for you. And they do take care of that for them, but it also comes with a whole new set of, like, they could create quotas or like encourage them to provide services that aren't necessary in order to drive up their bottom line.
Yeah. And I think, veterinary care is something where the vets that I've met over the years are just the most wonderful human beings. Like I have a dog. Her name's Kelly. In fact, this is totally not planned. When I opened this notebook, which I grabbed as I was running out of my house, I literally found a portrait of Kelly from my cousin, Marianne. Marianne, you did a beautiful job. Marianne Operthauser, you can follow her on social media. She does beautiful pet portraits. But every time, this is just like a side note, every time my dog, she is a pain in the ass. And every time that I take her to the vet and like they take her in the other room by herself, the vet will come back and be like, one of the sweetest dogs I've ever met. One of the best dogs. I'm like, really?
It changed personality in the back room.
I honestly think she does. Like, they're like, she had everyone back there laughing. I'm like, no, I love her with all my heart, but it's kind of like a kid where like sometimes somebody will meet somebody's kid and be like, they're just the best. And the parents like, are they?
What are you talking about?
So all of that to say, like, I've met some just like, I think so many people who go into that field are brilliant and they could do a million other things, but they don't go into the field for the money. They go into the field because they love animals, they love pets, and then they get into what is becoming this world and they're kind of like, what do I do? And so do you think we're going to see any trickle down effect of who actually goes to veterinary school? And are people going to stop getting pets as much when they realize after this round how expensive it has become?
I hope people don't stop getting pets. And I don't think people should stop going to veterinary school.
Yes.
I don't know what this would do to them, but it's really important that we have animal doctors, so it shouldn't drive people to stop going to school. I think that the solution that we should focus on is getting as much attention on measures that can regulate private equity, stop these excesses, so that when you go into a veterinary provider, you know that the people there are driven by care for animals and your pet, and that there's not this underlying financial motive that's somebody, a private equity owner in another room, is telling the veterinarian to follow.
Like push this service, push this treatment, et cetera.
And I think that gets to another issue, which is that a lot of these clinics, when they're bought by private equity, keep the same appearance, clinic. So like they don't change the branding or anything.
You might not know. You might have no idea. So if I go into my vet, which I'm so grateful is not owned by private equity, if I go into my vet and my spidey sense goes off that something might seem different, what can people even do to tell if something is owned by private equity, to tell if it's been sold?
It's really hard to tell if anything's been owned by private equity. Sometimes private equity firms will publish the information online because they want to promote that they have this new big acquisition. but they really don't have to disclose what they own or what they acquire. You may want to, I'm assuming your spidey sense is maybe a price has gone up or something.
Sure, yeah.
Sometimes the workers know about what's going on behind the scenes. So if you have that kind of relationship, you may want to ask, hey, do you know anything about?
Like, have you guys been
Exactly.
transferred ownership, et cetera? Well, a few people sent us questions. I got a couple questions regarding, the upcoming new administration, and then a couple questions about veterinary care. So do you mind if I throw those at you?
All right, let's hear them.
Okay. Somebody wants to know if the Trump family themselves has any ties to private equity.
As far as I know, I only know of one connection, but it's Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner.
We'll take it.
I believe he either is a partner or he's involved with a private equity firm.
Okay, good to know. Somebody wants to know about Mars, because Mars, which, we think of candy, is a big provider of veterinary clinics, has a lot of veterinary clinics. Is that private equity?
Mars is not private equity. They're just corporate owned. And I think that there's an important distinction to make here. And they have kind of corporate incentives as well. But I think that this gets to the short-term impacts of private equity, how they try to kind of flip a company in a short amount of time. If we take Mars at their word, then they are building a company for the long term. That's in contrast to private equity, which typically tries to get out within 3 to 7 years after making as much money as they can. And so they don't really care what the company, private equity doesn't care what it looks like after they've sold it, as long as they've made a return. So that's different from a regular corporate chain like Mars, which hasn't indicated that they're planning to sell anytime soon.
Okay, that's super helpful. Is this happening in Canada?
Probably happening in Canada, but I don't know myself. I can say that it's happening in it's happening in Great Britain.
Right. There's a ton of private equity over in the UK, isn't there?
I think 3 or 4 of their biggest chains are owned by private equity. Their biggest one is also, and they have a kind of their own FTC that's looking at consolidation of veterinary clinics by private equity there as well.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing is you have to keep in mind JAB or JAB Holdings. Yeah, they're in the UK. Yeah. Okay. Is this happening with therapy as well? Like human therapy?
Yes, it's happening in therapy. I don't know specifics, but it's happening across all types of healthcare, behavioral health, mental health, physical therapy, whatever type of therapy you're thinking of. Private equity is there. Their goals for a lot of industries, subsectors that are like individual providers is to roll them up into big chains, kind of like they're doing with the veterinary clinics. So if you are a therapist, beware any chains. They may be private equity owned.
Right. So if you were a therapist and you were thinking about, selling or et cetera. Okay. What do you think, we've talked a lot about the administrations. We've talked about veterinary care. Is there anything else I've started calling the people who listen to this podcast oddly specific. I've started calling them otters. I don't know if they're okay with it, but they'll have to get okay with it. What are there any other things that you are looking at right now that are coming down the pike that you think we should know about?
Yes. I'm not looking at, this was a report that I released last month on medical debt. So
Congratulations.
There's a massive thank you. There's a massive medical debt problem in the United States, about $220 billion in medical debt. People who can't afford to pay their healthcare bills are putting them onto credit cards. Sometimes the credit cards are private equity owned. And then if they can't pay off the credit card,
is it a health credit card kind of?
They called medical payment
products.
Sure.
I've seen those when I'm checking out at the doctor. Yeah.
So some of those are private equity owned, and then sometimes debt collectors are also private equity owned. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because as veterinary health gets more advanced, people are going into debt also to pay off their healthcare bills and using some of these same medical payment products. So they're going into the same kind of debt that people who have human healthcare go into, and private equity is sometimes behind that as well.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because just back to I was reading a lot of these pet insurance companies are private equity owned.
Yeah, pet insurance. I haven't looked too deeply into this, but you are correct. And a whole broad swath of pet services. So not just pet care, but pet stores, pet products across the board. Private equity is getting in. And it's because people are willing to spend more money on their pets. So they want a cut of that.
I'm so grateful for the work that you do and for the work that PESP does. And where can people find your organization?
We're on social media, PE Stakeholder. We've also got a website, pestakeholder.org. Feel free to reach out. Our emails are available on the website. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast again, Michael. You're a fan favorite and we love what you're doing.
Thank you, Meredith. This was great.